Recall our goal when solving equations. We are trying to get the variable isolated. In order to do that with multi-step equations, we must move all numbers to one side of the equation and all variables to the other. Remember, it does not matter what you decide to move first. However, I prefer to move all numbers to the right-hand side and then all variables to the left. So in this problem, the first thing we can do is move the -3 by adding a +3 to both sides. This will leave us with the equation 2x equals x plus 12. Next, we would need to move variables to the left by adding a -x on both sides. We are now left with 1x equals 12. Our last step would then be to divide by 1 on both sides of the equation. This leaves us with the final answer of x equals 12. Now take a look at the following equation. Most students find this to be overwhelming as it contains fractions. Although we can try to solve this equation as is, it would be much better if there was a way we could get rid of the fractions before we tried to start solving the equation. Remember, the great thing about equations is that we can do whatever we want to with them as long as we do it to both sides. Before we get to solving this problem, let's first take a look at how to get rid of a fraction by multiplying it by a whole number. Then we will return to this problem and figure out how to solve it. There are really two ways that you can go about multiplying a whole number times a fraction. The first way is probably the way that most students were taught. You start by multiplying the whole number times the numerator. So in this problem, 24 times 5 is 120. Next, you would divide by the denominator. 120 divided by 8 gives us 15. Though you can still multiply fractions and whole numbers this way, in the equations we will be solving, it will be much easier to start off by dividing the whole number by the denominator. In this case, 24 divided by 8 would give us 3. Next, we can multiply by the numerator. So 5 times 3 is 15. Notice our answers were the same, but it's easier to start off by dividing by the denominator if our whole number is divisible by the denominator. In all of the equations we will be solving, we will use the following steps to multiply whole numbers and fractions. First, we will divide the whole number by the denominator. Next, we will multiply our answer by the numerator. When we are trying to get rid of the fractions in our equations, we will want to multiply all the terms by a common denominator. Simply stated, a common denominator is a number that all of the denominators will go into. In this example, looking at the denominators, what is a number that all of them will go into? Well, 8, 3, and 12 will all go into the number 24. So 24 can be a common denominator. Could you have used another number? Of course. For example, all three denominators would go into the number 48. It does not matter what common denominator you choose. However, the lower you go, the easier time you will have when multiplying. Sometimes you will not always be able to just look at the denominators to determine a number that all of them will go into. If you are struggling to find a common denominator, you can always find one by multiplying all of the denominators together. For example, in the fractions 1/7, 2/9, and 3/5, it's not easy to look at 7, 9, and 5 and determine a number that all of them will go into. In order to do that, we can multiply 7 times 9 times 5 and get a common denominator of 315. Let's go back to the equation we looked at initially. Before we solve this equation, we want to get rid of the fractions by multiplying both sides of the equation by a common denominator. First, we must ask ourselves, what is the common denominator between all of the fractions in our equation? All of the denominators will go into the number 4, so we can use 4 as our common denominator. Recall with equations, whatever you do to one side of the equation, you must do to the other. So we are going to have to multiply every term in our equation by 4. By multiplying every term on both sides of the equation, we are not changing the equation's value, but we are simply rewriting it so we do not have to work with fractions. Notice I have now written the equation so that every term is being multiplied by our common denominator of 4. We just discussed how we will be multiplying fractions and whole numbers, by first dividing by the denominator and then multiplying by the numerator. Starting with our first term on the left-hand side, 4 divided by 4 is 1, and 1 times 5x is 5x. Next, negative 1 times 4 is negative 4. So on the left-hand side of the equation, by multiplying both terms by 4, we are left with 5x minus 4. On the right-hand side, 4 divided by 4 is 1, and 1 times 3x gives us 3x. Finally, 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 2 times 1 is 2. On the right-hand side, we are left with 3x plus 2. Compared to our original equation, the new equation we now have by multiplying everything by a common denominator seems much easier to solve. We can now add 4 to both sides. Next, we can move the 3x by adding a negative 3x to both sides. Our final step would then be to divide by 2, leaving us with the answer x equals 3. Let's look at another example. We want to first determine what is going to be the common denominator between the fractions in our equation. Our denominators in this equation are 7 and 6. Instead of trying to guess a number that both will go into, multiply them together to get a common denominator of 42. Next, we will multiply everything in our equation by our common denominator. Be careful with the first term. Remember, we want to first divide by the denominator, so 42 divided by 7 will give us 6. Next, we will multiply 6 by the numerator. In this case, our numerator is x plus 2, so we're going to have to distribute the 6 to our entire numerator. 6 times x gives us 6x, and 6 times 2 gives us 12. Next, on the right-hand side, 42 divided by 6 is 7, and 7 times x is 7x. Finally, 2 times 42 gives us 84. Now we have 6x plus 12 equals 7x plus 84. We can now start solving this equation by adding a negative 12 to both sides. Next, we can add a negative 7x to both sides. This leaves us with the equation negative 1x equals 72. Our final step would be to get rid of the negative 1 by dividing by negative 1 on both sides. Our final answer would then be x equals negative 72. First, let's determine a common denominator. A number that both 3 and 5 will go into is 15. So we will multiply everything in our equation by our common denominator of 15. This problem is different than the other problems in the fact that we have the distributive property. Some find it easier to go ahead and distribute before they get rid of the fractions. However, since many students do not like fractions, know that you can get rid of them as your first step. When you are multiplying by your common denominator of 15, leave what is inside the parentheses the same, only multiplying terms outside the parentheses by 15. 1/3 times 15 gives us 5. On the right hand side, 1/5 times 15 gives us 3. And finally, 2 times 15 gives us 30. Now your next step would be to use the distributive property to rewrite the equation. In our rewritten problem, notice that you can combine like terms on the right hand side. Combining 12 and 30 gives us 42. Our rewritten problem is now 5x minus 10 equals 3x plus 42. We will start by adding positive 10 to both sides. Next, we will move the 3x by adding a negative 3x to both sides. And our final step would be to divide by 2, leaving us with the answer x equals 26. Let's look at the steps we have just used to solve equations with fractions. First, you must always find a common denominator between all of the fractions in the equation. Remember, if you cannot find a common denominator, multiply all of the denominators in the problem together to get a common denominator. Multiply every term that is not in parentheses by a common denominator. Finally, distribute if needed, combine like terms, and solve. At this point, pause the video and try solving this equation on your own. When you are ready, play the video to check your answer. We first want to decide what is our common denominator. Both 5 and 3 will go into 15, so we will multiply everything in our equation by 15. In the first term, 15 divided by 5 is 3. Remember, we must take that 3 and multiply it by our entire numerator. 3 times x is 3x, and 3 times negative 3 is negative 9. On the right-hand side, 1 times 5 gives us 15, and negative x over 3 times 15 gives us negative 5x. Next, we can add 9 to both sides. We can then move the negative 5x by adding a positive 5x to both sides. Our final step would be to divide both sides by 8. This leaves us with the answer of x equals 3. Pause the video and try another equation on your own. When you are ready, play the video to check your answer. Since we only have one fraction in our equation, our common denominator would be 4. We are then going to multiply everything not in parentheses by 4. 3/4 times 4 gives us 3. Negative 3 times 4 gives us negative 12. And on the right hand side, 3 times 4 gives us 12. Next, we can distribute. We are then left with the equation 6x plus 18 minus 12 equals 12x plus 36. On the left-hand side of the equation, we can combine together 18 and negative 12 to give us 6. Next, we can move the 6 by adding a negative 6 to both sides. We can then move 12x by adding a negative 12x to both sides. This leaves us with negative 6x equals 30. Our final step would be to divide both sides by negative 6, giving us the final answer of x equals negative 5.